done. And I will start with a quick introduction of the smartlab network, which is a platform which is hosting this meeting today. So smartlab.network was founded about 3 years ago in Basel as a spin-off of the Future Labs Live, out of the finding that we just need, especially with the academic community, we need a better interaction and better collaborations on automation issues. Because with, like on the commercial side with Zila, which is co-hosting this meeting, there is like a decent platform, but we felt that the academic interest should be better represented in a separate association. And we've been doing these regular lecture series since the very beginning. So this is, I don't know, maybe the 20th or so for 2 years now. And the idea is that people from the community just present their work. And so ideally we find collaboration. So because we've witnessed in the past so many times that just the wheel is being reinvented and there are many parallel developments. And it's fine to have parallel developments, but it's good to just join forces and get forward together. And with this quick introduction, I will introduce now Radhika. Radhika will present another network, which is eRobotics. And then Radhika will present the speakers as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Tim. So hello, everyone. I'm Radhika. So I'm from EU Robotics, which is a robotics network at the European level. As you can guess from the name, it's a public-private partnership. And as part of that network, there are various topic groups that are led by volunteers, which are working on industrial robotics, healthcare robotics, laboratory robotics, and aerial robotics, and so on. So myself and Patrick Courtney, we both co-lead the topic group on laboratory robotics. So that is a platform which is free to join, although EU Robotics itself is a membership organization, but the topic groups that they run are completely led by volunteers and free to take part for anyone. So as part of the laboratory robotics topic group, we try to bring together the stakeholders of labs from like chemistry labs, life science labs, biotech, food, and so there is a lab in different industries what we are trying to educate, and also educate the robotics community. What are the challenges that are in the labs which require automation in robotics? So with that, I'll stop the introduction about EU Robotics as well as the topic group on laboratory robotics. I'll post some links in the chat for you to explore further about that. But I'll now pass on to the first speaker, Patrick Courtney, who's also in the board of SELA, Standards in Lab Automation Group. And he'll be talking about the standards in the lab and what are they and who would need them. Off to you, Patrick.
All right, thanks very much, Radhika. So this is I'm going to be sharing the microphone time with my colleague Burkhard Schaefer a little bit later on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about standards. I've been involved in standards off and on for a long, long time. As Radhika indicated, I'm most closely associated with SELA, but there's a lot of information about standards which is not very well understood. And when I did my engineering degree, we didn't really talk about it. And even now, I don't think that's much. So I've got a few slides on the background, then I'll go into some details on SELA, and then hand over to Burkhard. Hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. So I'll start off with back to front, give an example of an application that was put together thanks to standards. This is a mobile robot that carries out cell culture over the weekend and in the evening when people would much rather be at home. It was put together in a large biotech in Basel area. And what you see there is a mobile robot built on a chassis from MIR, commonly used in warehouses. There's a universal robot arm. There's a camera system attached, and it's picking up microtiter plates or well plates out of a automated or adapted refrigerator there, which keeps the media cool, and then it's opening up on an incubator where it's going to take out some cell culture. So this is a speeded up video. So normally to do this by hand, you'd have to take the material out of the fridge, wait 20 minutes for it to warm up and so on. But the robot doesn't care about that. It can carry on doing this. And each of these components has been made SELA friendly, SELA compatible. So the platform base, the robot, and the vision system put together by Aztec Projects, the fridge and the incubator with an adapted door opener with a little sealer controller box. The system then goes off and takes the samples and puts them in front of an incubator. That's not actually an imaging system to judge how the confluence. It's not shown, and then it's taking it over to a safety hood, which is from scan, and again controlled by a sealer interface box, and it's got to put it in front of the Andrew Alliance arm, which is controlled within a cadmium wrapper, so which is sealer compatible, so that each of the different elements from the different suppliers has been made to be sealer compatible, either off the shelf in the case of the robot, custom made in the case of the fridge and incubator, or software adapted in the case of this robot. So you've got 6 or 7 devices there. There's an overall orchestrator from another company, very, very quickly put together thanks to sealer standards. One of the interesting things that happened during that project is that the company that provided the orchestrating control system was a startup, and they changed their strategy under pressure from their funders and decided they didn't want to go down this route anymore. Normally that would be a disaster for a lab automation project because one of your main suppliers has backed out. However, in this case, because it was all using standards, another supplier also of a sealer compatible orchestrator was able to step in, and it was up and running again in a very short period of time. So the advantage of standards there to deliver an application, it's just a demo, but an application which is useful in the lab and facilitated by standards, different vendors coming together to the satisfaction of the user. So I kick off with that just to give you some kind of application context. Whoops, let me stop this. And then I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about standards more generally. So some of you will have seen this this famous joke from XKCD. Of course, there are lots of standards. We know we've all seen the situation where somebody says, why don't I have a standard for what I want to do? And then they go off and start doing it. But standards is a very long and painful journey. Sealer's been doing it for more than 10 years. The SBS lab plate took, I think, only 20 years. It's a long and painful journey, and it's about people rather than just the technology and the documents. So just a few slides to try and illustrate some of that. I kind of like to annotate this slide as saying, well, you say examples where there are standards that proliferate, but there are many examples when standards work. GSM, Wi-Fi, the banking IBAN, JPEG images, the DIN paper format, at least in Europe, they're all standardized. And when standards work, you really don't notice it. It's when they don't work that it's very frustrating. So the person who says, hey, I need this, I mean, I'm not sure who that is. It's not me. Maybe it's one of you. But when someone stands up and says that, they're not really realizing maybe that they're trying to create a whole new community. And situation where there are 15 competing standards, it's not necessarily a user who just doesn't care sometimes, who just wants to get on with it. It's not someone who's read the documentation where there's information in there. And it's certainly not someone who's got an experience of standards. And I put in the corner here, if my camera was working, you'd be able to see me hold one up. It's a UK-Europe adapter plug. I'm from the UK originally. I live in Germany. And this is an adapter. There are 2 standards between the UK and mainland Europe. And nobody really cares if they remember to pack the adapter in their suitcase. It just works. I've got a long background. I won't dwell on that from a user perspective and a company perspective and developer perspective. So what people think standards look like is this. It's a really boring document. It either gives you a headache to try and read it and understand it because it's written in a really odd, terse language, or at worst, it ends up in your boss going to jail because she did not follow the rules. In the case of regulated environments and industries, this is a very real risk. So standards are, unpleasant one way or the other. But the reality is that standards look like this. It's a bunch of people around a table or on a Zoom call, trying to solve problems, trying to share points of view, trying to collaborate and find consensus on particular technical issues or organizational issues. It's about networks, it's professional contacts, it's insights, it's tools like that ruler at the bottom, job offers, collaborations, projects, and business. And that's what really happens. And that's what we see within Sealer, where Sealer is a standard setting organization built around a consortium, but we also see a lot of business happening, a lot of collaboration happening, a lot of papers being published, and a lot of feel good happening, even though at the end of the day, it's a document which looks a bit inhuman and terse. There's confusion around standards in part because there's an expectation that there's no single universal standard. In actual fact, there are 4 classes of standard. This is a material I've borrowed from my ex-professor, Peter Swan at Manchester. There's interface standards, so again, that plug in the wall. There's this idea of quality standards. So some people are often thinking about safety. And when you go and buy a car or drive a car, you hope that it submits to safety qualities. But there's a law in economics called Gresham's law, where if nobody understands what the quality of what they're buying, the lowest quality product will win out, and people who have good quality products will not put them on the market for the price, because there's no way of saying whether something's good or bad. That's where quality standards with a quality stamp comes in and helps the user, the consumer, decide. There's variety reduction standards. The example there is shoe size. Maybe it doesn't actually fit very well, and if you have enough money, you go to an Italian designer who will design them custom to your foot. But we all save money by submitting to the shoe size in the shops. And then there's measurement standards, the inch, the centimeter, the SI system. And in 100 or 200 years ago, many different countries had different measurement standards. We've now kind of converged. So where do standards contribute? So there's a kind of ladder, TRL ladder of innovation, starting from pure research, basic oriented research, applied research, all the way through to products and commercialization. And there's different kinds of standards that play different roles. I know some academics and some researchers are sometimes set against standards because they seem to limit freedom and lock people in too early. And that for sure is a risk. Early on, it's good to be able to share vocabulary. I've been talking to you in English, and I know that many people on the call, English is not their first language. And we agree, thankfully for me, that we'll do this webinar in English so that we share a certain vocabulary and way of organizing our thoughts. A bit later on, you want to measure and test things. Then you want to integrate and do applied research. You'll focus on interfaces and interoperability. And then when you want to sell and buy a product, compatibility and safety becomes super important. So just another couple of slides just on standards in the broader context. So we see the standards document. We might buy something from ISO and wonder where it came from and why we have to, and how and why we have to submit to it. But actually, it's part of, for me, it's part of a spectrum going from the dictionary, the vocabulary. Maybe somebody's produced a guideline, published something on the web about their ideas as a best practice. A group of people get together, and it all goes all the way across to laws, where the standards get enshrined in laws, especially around the quality and safety, because there are serious consequences when it goes wrong. And we know about that from automotive manufacturing, from aerospace manufacturing, and indeed for pharmaceutical industries. We want the drugs, products to be safe. And then beyond that, we have ethics and values of society, which are always dynamic, always changing, and laws are always a little bit in the lag compared to some of that. So there's often some confusion that comes from that. And the other dimension to look at it is it's rarely an individual who sets the standard. It's a team of people who will sit around the table, build a community, and eventually it'll be global. And when this process is largely invisible, but if we look back at what's happened with GSM phone standards, 5G, that's very much what's happened. And don't forget, of course, you're completely free to ignore standards and do dangerous things like in that picture there. You know the consequences. That's what may happen. I'm going to switch now to talk a little bit about SEALA, the case of standards in the lab. The two that we like to think about is the SBS lab plate standard. Fantastic piece of work, 100, 1,000 times increase in productivity. The nearest comparable thing, I think, in the rest of the world is the container, the 20-foot, 40-foot container from the 1950s. That took a long time, was very unpopular in some places, but actually managed to save, I think, 20, 40 times cheaper shipping of systems and products across the globe because of the modularity, the interoperability between the ships, the savings at dockside, and so on. What we do in SEALA, we have an interoperability standard. Sometimes I call it the USB of the lab. Of course, it's not a physical connector, it's a software. It sits on top of the physical connection. We have a part A, which is a core, which has been developed over time by the technical team. We've got a mapping, which maps the concepts to a concrete terminology, provides implementation guide, and there's a part C, which was missing in a previous generation, which allows flexible evaluation and extension. There's a governance process that goes behind that. It's lighter weight in SEALA than it would be in something like ISO, but it adapts to where we are in the lab and the size of the community and the friendliness it has. There are community reference implementations available on GitLab, and I believe now there are open source bindings in at least 4 different languages. So it's a document, it's a book online, and it's a set of code which implements it. SEALA tries to align the interests of these different groups, and as you'll have picked up earlier when I talked about cars, what vendors want to do and what users want to do is not always aligned. We need to sit down and share our thoughts. So users, vendors, and integrators who had a very painful task, and more recently we've involved academics and startups who have a lot to bring. Some big academic sites that have been set up, and we're very thankful that people like Tim are in the community there and really pushing things forward in terms of adoption. And startups, what we find is that their funders don't want their money to be wasted on rehashing something that nobody's very interested in. Nobody wants to do interfaces really when you could be focusing on some cool stuff. Some of the logos on the right hand side of organization that support us originally started in Roche Novartis in Basel from the pain that they suffered there. Just one slide on the structure. It's a service orientation, peer-to-peer, control of instruments, workflow, reporting, and avoids that manual data transcription. It's loosely coupled and it's based on internet technologies that we use pretty much every day, every hour as we receive emails. So HTTP, gRPC, XML, open standards, no license fees, no royalties. And just a couple of slides to close for my part, just to explain how it might work. So there's a Sealer server element, there's a Sealer client element, and they need to find a way of talking to one another. The first part is the Sealer discovery, where let's call it a LIM system says, hello, what's out there, like your phone does when you turn on the Wi-Fi and you scan the world. And then you might get a response from, say, a balance in the lab says, hey, I'm here, and a chromatography data system which says also, hey, I'm here. And from that, the LIM system will know what's about, and it can start to connect and learn to carry out some tasks. So what can you do? The balance will say, I can weigh, I'm an analytical balance. And the chromatography data system will also tell you what it can do. So now we're starting to get a dialogue between the autonomous systems in the lab environment that can exchange plug and play fairly seamlessly thanks to Sealer. And just to close on the kind of services you might see in a device, a balance is quite a simple device compared to a CDS. However, it is quite complex in terms of what it can provide. The Sealer service, it will provide a weighing service for a quality performance. You would have a calibration service, you would have a monitoring service and a qualification service. So pretty quickly you get a little portfolio of services, and if it's a more complex instruments, you'd have even more. And I'm going to stop there and maybe hand over to Burkhard to tell us about data. Thank you.
That sounds good. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Should we include some questions for Patrick, or should we just continue?
That's what I was about to ask. Should we stop for questions for Patrick, or listen to Burkhard and then take the questions? Which way do you prefer, Patrick?
I think we go straight into Burkhard. Hopefully people can keep it in their head. Yep.
Okay.
I'll put them in the chat.
Okay, so now let's take a look at the data side of things. Obviously, we've been looking at it from the Sealer perspective, from a communication side. So how do we get an interactive dialogue between different systems, one of them potentially being some type of a leading system, and on the other hand, the instrument or a related service that we want to encourage to do something for us. But then obviously there is the data side of things, because just like the conducting of the experiment is the big bang that sets it all off, or that gets the model train to run, now we need to go ahead and capture the data. Because if we're thinking about it, we're in it for the data. We're walking into the lab with a sample in hand because we're looking to generate some type of a result. So the lab is a digitization engine, just like a scanner digitizes a piece of paper. A lab digitizes a sample in a way that it determines its characteristics and it turns it into a data trail. So since that data is the most important result of our work in the lab, let's make sure that data becomes as accessible as possible so we can do interesting things. Now, that accessibility itself doesn't generate value, but it enables the value generation. So we can integrate multiple systems, get the data to flow between the instrument and the LIMS and an ELN and things like that. We can do data analytics using traditional measures like statistics, but also all the way to machine learning and AI, and we'll talk about that a little bit. We can use it to collaborate with partners inside and outside of our organization. We can retain data for the long term, and sometimes we have regulatory requirements to do so. And we get to reuse it because that data holds knowledge and can help us with future initiatives or to troubleshoot. So one observation over the years has been the more accessible we make our data, the more it will be used. And that's easy to understand, right? If it's too difficult and I, as an end user, can't get to the data sets that I want, and I first need to hire a data scientist to do that work for me, well, how likely is it that I'm going to do that for every question that I have? But if we are able to empower the users to work with the data that's been generated across the organization, then that's a different story. And we find that as people implement these accessibility layers, that there is a huge pickup in terms of the utilization of the data. And as well, the more accessible we make our data, the less it costs to use. So as part of the total cost of ownership, we can also speak about a total cost of access, right? So each time I touch the data, what type of effort do I have to go through in order to get there? Yeah, and so every time I want to generate value out of my data, there is a cost to it, and I want to keep that incremental cost, that marginal cost, as low as possible. So how complex is that in practice? And here's a nice little analogy that tries to show this. So we've got instrument software that is generating our data, right? We've got software that's driving the instrument, and as soon as we enter the world of the instrument software that has been nicely set up by my instrument vendor, life is beautiful. All of the things are there, and I can get to them, and so on. But I have to enter the store in order to do that. So, in other words, as long as I stay within that ecosystem of the vendor, yeah, life is pretty and beautiful. But unfortunately, the window is not as clean, so that I can't as easily consume the data from the outside. They want me in there, and that's fair. Yeah, but sometimes I need to be able to work with that data from outside of the original software. So unfortunately, the window here is a little bit dirty, and it's not as easy to get the data out. But the good news is that some stores will sell us one of these magic tools that allow us to get to the data. And these tools have different names. Some people call them a squeegee, others call them an API, others call them an SDK, export license, and so on. Yeah, but you can basically unlock the data by leveraging one of these tools that you can get from many of our instrument suppliers. Not everyone, but yeah. And then suddenly you can see your shiny data from the outside. The problem, though, is that we are not only using a single instrument, we've got more of these. So it's not just data are us, but we also have the data emporium. And the problem is that that other store has more of my data, but the squeegee that I bought from the previous supplier doesn't work on this window. Yeah, that's the that's the funny thing. Yeah, and so I can get another tool, yeah, and get their squeegee as well, and now access my data. The problem is I have to repeat that for every instrument that I have, and if I look at a larger ecosystem, then suddenly it becomes very, very costly. And that's where open data formats come in. So formats like Animal can bring all of these stores together, so that regardless of the underlying data type or format, I can view the data, I can process it, I can share it, compare it, and archive it, and so on. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Animal format. Sila and Animal have been working together for a very long time. Animal stands for Analytical Information Markup Language, comes out of ASTM, where there's a working group, and it was built by a consortium across industry, academia, vendors, government entities, and so on. And it has a very modular approach to work with data across instrument types. So there is a generic core XML schema, and then there are technique definitions on top of them that say how to use Animal for a particular type of experiment. And that makes it scalable. So I can put together software today that's able to work with data from instrumentation that doesn't even exist yet, because technique definitions can allow us to describe what that data looks like, and then I have a machine-readable definition that I can leverage to access that content. So this gives me one common accessible format for my instrument data, and that's obviously great, because suddenly if I have things like Sila and Animal coming together, I can look across different types of instruments in one common way. And that could be things like time series data that I get from my incubator here. It can be analytical data like chromatography, spectroscopy, where we also have a beautiful initiative between the Sila and Animal communities. Or I can look at things like rheology data. I can look at individual experiments, or also do trending across multiple. And that's quite interesting. And since I now see a lot of data passing by, I can also look at things like instrument utilization. I can look at visualization of the data outside of my original instrument software. So I can do all the processing that I wanted in the original software, but also outside if there is a need to cross these boundaries. And let's apply that to some typical software tools. So here we've got Chromeleon, which is a chromatography data system from Thermo Fisher, and this is a screenshot of Chromeleon, and we are using it here to display a data set. And now we are taking that through an animal converter, and we can see that if we open that in the viewer, it shows us the very same chromatogram with peaks highlighted, integrated, the full tables, and so on. So it's all there. And the nice thing is that we can do all this across different types of instruments. So if we go with Agilent and we look at their chromatography data system, we've also got a converter for this. So we do the same thing, and suddenly the data becomes comparable, and I can do common downstream processing this way. Now we can take this even further. We can look at it across additional types of instruments, and we can do comparisons between these. So this is if we're a bit more in the GC world, this is Cyan instruments. Or if we go in towards ion chromatography, you know, we can compare peak shapes across runs at different concentrations. Great for method building, sophisticated analytics, and then we go from here. We can also take this on further to look at things like particle size distribution. This is Malvern, so completely different measurement technique, but the same format and the same tooling. And that's actually quite nice. We can now also take this into other leading systems, so that if we have something like LIMS or an ELN, we can take that data and embed the viewer into it. So if you take a look here, you can see that in Labware and in Lavantage, you can actually get to see your chromatograms and spectra. Let's move here. Now we have the nice situation where in an animal and CELA world, this stuff that we just saw, which looks like, you know, it's actually quite magic. This is table stakes. This is not the future. This is what we are doing on a daily basis already. And now this is a good foundation to make the data exploitable and usable in an AI scenario. And I want to close with this because there's been great work in the community where a couple of users and vendor organizations have come together to expose this content to large language model data. So you can ask questions like, is there a retention time drift in my HPLC chromatograms from a particular sequence? And then it goes ahead and you've enabled a large language model, in this case it's Claude, to talk to the underlying data store, and it knows how to read animal document content and interpret it, and then it can look at things like, obviously here this is synthetic data, so we're not getting any drift here, but we can answer questions like that by making the data accessible, and if we make it accessible to a human being, it's also not that far away that we make it accessible to large language model like this. And here we've got a different example where not only can you train a model ahead of time to then ask questions, but you can also have the model live access the data. So for example, to determine instrument status or to get concrete values from a particular, from a particular set of sensors and so on. So this is where we are then leveraging that normalization of the data and a common way of self-describing the data sets by augmenting that with tools that large language models can call. So the model understands how to use that kind of data and how to perform proper scientific operations on it. So that's a bit of a view on the data side of the house. And I think it's pretty evident how this nicely complements what we can do on the instrument control side. And I think some of us will be a bit more on the side of, we want to drive the equipment. We want to send a command. We want the instrument to do this, And then on the other hand, some of us will be more on the data side. We want to analyze the data sets. We want to take them from one system to the other. And the truth will be somewhere in the middle, And that's why I think it's such a valuable ecosystem where we can bring these two types of streams together. So that's it from my side. And I'm gonna hand it back now. Thank you.
Thank you, Burkhard. So do we have any questions to, well, I will, for the question part, I will turn off the video. So at first, thank you, Burkhard, very much for the presentation, and Patrick. And we stop.